before, gee, quick question. What does that say on clams? Is that PRKE?
No, price level adjusted mortgages. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So good news, every single person that took the midterm improved their score.
It wasn't hard to do.
So, moving forward. All right, so today, here's our list of topics. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover, so we'll go ahead and kind of jump in. So the first one of the things that we're going to be exploring a lot more in detail during the real estate investments course coming up in the kind of the second half of the fall semester is the implication of income taxes and how that affects an investor's rate of return. In this course, we're really focused on the lender side of things, and the only reason we kind of bring this up in your book, one of the motivations for borrowing on the part of an investor is that you receive what's referred to as an interest tax shield, or basically interest deduction off of your income that you generate on a commercial property. Now you also, on residential property, like for example your personal residence, and it's a little bit different, but in essence with your personal residence, you also get to write off as an interest deduction the amount of interest that you pay each year on your mortgage, but that's subject to basically you exceeding your sort of standardized deduction, okay? Whereas with commercial real estate, that's not the case. Commercial real estate, that obviously for each individual property, you're going to be looking at what your obviously income is, but more specifically, looking at what you potentially can get as an interest deduction. And we're going to be getting into that in much more detail, like I said, in the investments course. But for this one, all we're really going to do is basically figure out how much interest that you would be paying during the second year or third year or fourth year or fifth year for a property, and then using that as the sort of the interest deduction. So to sort of start this off, we'll pick a mortgage amount, let's say $500,000. And once again, assume this is 12 payments per year. Okay, and let's say it's a 15-year mortgage with an interest rate of, let's say, 7%. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and calculate whatever the payment is.
And this is interest tax shield?
Yep. Okay, so that's your monthly payment. Now, this next piece is to calculate for either 1 year or multiple years what the amount of interest that you would be able to deduct as your sort of interest tax shield would be for this property. So what we'll do is we'll do it for the first 3 years, okay? So year one is going to be one input, what? 12. Shift, amortize, equal. So let's just go ahead and see what we get. So for the first year, we're going to get an interest tax shield or deduction of $34,380.71. Okay? So that's just our interest. Okay, for year two, it's going to be what? 13. Input 24. So it goes down just a little bit because you paid down some of the loan, but it goes down to $32,967.51. And then the third year would be 25, and put 36. Okay, so all we've given you here is what the dollar amount would be each year that you would be able to take as a tax deduction for your interest expense. Now, does anybody know what the difference is between a tax deduction versus a tax credit? Because there's a big difference here that we're going to talk about obviously in more detail in the investments course, but right now, the difference between a tax deduction and a tax credit. What's the difference? Anybody? Max?
Is this what I asked you about a couple weeks ago?
Maybe.
The tax credit is where you can, you pay it off later.
It's not so much you pay it off later, no. Okay, so a tax deduction is a reduction in your income, okay, for tax purposes. So in other words, you take whatever income you have, you subtract out this deduction, and that has adjusted your income that will then be applied to some sort of a tax rate. Okay, does that make sense? Conceptually. In other words, think of it like this. Let's say that your income is $100,000. And then by being able to subtract this interest expense, let's just take the first one as an example, $34,380.71. If we subtract that out, we end up now with taxable income. Now I'm shortcutting some steps just to illustrate the concept. We're going to get into much more detail and specificity later, but right now what that's doing is that's reducing your income or your taxable income by the $34,380. Now, if this is now our new taxable income and our marginal tax rate is, let's say, 28%, that means our taxes payable would be $18,373, okay? But let's assume for a second that we didn't have any interest expense, okay? That we maybe just paid cash money for the project, therefore there's no debt, therefore there's no interest expense. Then all of our income would be taxable, meaning 28% times the income would mean we would have a tax bill of $28,000. Okay, so if you sort of compare these two numbers, the difference of about $10,000 roughly is what is directly attributable to the tax deduction of the interest expense. So in other words, you're sort of, because the tax rate being 28%, you're roughly saving, in this case, $10,000 because of that. Does that make sense? Yes or no? Now, the question that I asked previously was, what is the difference between a tax deduction, which is what this is, and a tax credit. A tax credit, which in real estate, there's only a handful of things that qualify for tax credits. Specifically, you have low-income housing tax credits, you have tax credits for renovating historic properties, you may have some tax credits associated with different types of special sort of government intervention kind of projects, either at the state or federal or local level. But for the most part, most everything is going to be an actual deduction. But this tax credit, the difference there is if I told you that you had a $10,000 tax credit, what that would mean is you would be able to take whatever you've got for your taxes payable and then just simply subtract from that a tax credit of $10,000, meaning now your new tax payable would be $8,373.40. So here's my point. Both the impact in terms of roughly the dollar amount is the same, about $10,000 off of your what your tax bill would be for getting the deduction, but yet you had to spend, in essence, $34,000 in order to get that benefit, whereas a tax credit may just be given to you because you fulfill some sort of project requirements that may or may not actually cost you money. And in some cases they do, some cases they don't, depending on how they're structured. Okay? So my point with that is, if you had to choose between getting a tax deduction versus a tax credit, what would you choose? Which one's going to give you the bigger bang for the buck?
Credit.
A tax credit, okay? That's what we're trying to sort of illustrate here, is that if the government were to say, all right, we're going to change tax policy, which they do quite often, and say, all right, we want to migrate from giving tax deductions to giving tax credits, quite frankly, the tax credits would be probably a much more advantageous sort of thing to get, okay? But you need to understand the difference between the two, that the tax deduction is a reduction in your income, your taxable income, whereas the tax credit is a reduction in your taxes payable, a dollar for dollar reduction in your taxes payable, okay? Does that make sense?
Yeah, in that example, you've given both of them.
Right.
So.
You're getting both benefit just for the purposes of our example.
Okay.
Never would happen like this in reality, where you would probably get both, or at least, well, I mean, yes, you would get both in the sense of, let's say that you have a low-income housing project, you would get obviously the interest deduction, plus you're also going to get the tax deduction for having a low-income housing project and meeting all the criteria set out by HUD as it relates to those.
Right.
But when you're making the calculations, you always start first with the deductions and only at
Yes.
the end you
Yes.
take off the credit.
Correct. Yep. Deductions come first, followed by credits, if you have it. But the overwhelming majority of real estate projects do not have tax credits. Almost all have tax deductions, well, pretty much all have tax deductions if they have any sort of expenses associated with the project. Okay. Any questions?
Just one other question. You know, they have the development areas that, and I can't remember what.
Enterprise zones or?
Yeah, right, exactly. Now, are they tax credit zones? Is that what?
Some of those are, absolutely.
Opportunity zones.
And all of it is meant to, basically, every so often, the federal government, the state government, the local governments, either individually or collectively, decide they want to somehow intervene into the real estate markets. And the reason for that intervention, typically, is for some sort of a redevelopment to occur. And to try to come up with ways to incentivize developers to do projects in these areas that would ordinarily would not draw their attention because there's, you know, maybe the raw economics may not be there relative to some other part of the city or part of the state or whatever it might be. And so they try to create these sort of market interventions, usually driven by some sort of tax incentive or tax credit to basically say, hey, if you do this, you're going to save money on your income taxes or get money back or whatever it might be. So you're going to be more willing to do that project.
I think they're doing that in Overtown right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's
opportunity zones.
yeah, opportunity zones, enterprise, I mean, there's all, literally there's a different flavor of the day, you know, I mean, and in terms of what these things are called and how they're set up and what their motivation is, but almost always underlying them is an economic redevelopment sort of purpose, okay? And it basically is left to the imagination of local government, state government, federal government officials to come up with what these policies are going to be that will hopefully drive that kind of redevelopment. And it may actually be a situation of where they may incentivize not just the developer, but they may incentivize lenders as well to get involved in certain areas, okay? So, you know, they can come at it from a variety of different angles. Okay, question?
Yes, so a tax credit is a reduction of tax payable, but a tax deduction is a reduction of taxes. Is that
A reduction of taxable income.
the taxable income?
Okay, all right, any questions from the Zoom gallery? Okay.
But the example you just gave regarding those enterprise zones, are those credits or are they rebates?
Once again, I mean, it's going to depend on the specifics of that particular type of enterprise zone. Some are going to be either rebates, some are going to be tax credits, some are going to be some other mechanism to reduce overall cost or to reward the developer. Every single one of these things is a little bit different, or a lot different. Okay, but what you need to focus on is to realize why the governments, number one, are doing these things, and then number two, what it translates into in terms of modifying your relative interest or attractiveness to doing one of these deals within one of these areas because of these incentives. The problem that some people get sort of pulled into is just because the government creates these incentives, whether it's tax incentives, whether it's rebates, whether it's tax abatements, whatever it is, just because the government, at whatever level, state, local, federal, just because they offer these things does not necessarily mean that all of a sudden that makes it a good deal, okay? All they're doing is they're trying to kind of push things in a direction that would make a particular area to invest in or develop in more attractive than what it ordinarily would be. But sometimes, I mean, think of it like this. If you have an area that is so downtrodden, so economically depressed, so filled with crime and just, you know, it's pretty much a lost cause for all intents and purposes. But yet the government says, okay, hey, we're going to create all these, you know, incentives to kind of redevelop in this area and so forth. Sometimes it'll work, sometimes it won't. And usually the way that they, you know, can begin to kind of make it work is they'll usually try to start off with some sort of a signature project, a larger scale project, where they'll offer all these sort of incentives and that sort of thing, and that will be kind of the Kickstarter to hopefully get some of the, you know, more mid-sized or smaller projects to kind of buy in and move things forward. But the problem is just because the government offers all these incentives. And in some cases, the incentives are crazy. In some cases, they'll say, hey, we're going to give you the land. We are going to rebate your taxes, your property taxes, for the next 10 years. And we're not going to charge you any sales tax for anything that you may, put into this area. On the surface, you're like, whoa, that, is amazing, okay? But if you're building whatever it is, whether you're building a hotel, you're building retail, if no one is willing to go there and stay in a hotel, if no one is willing to go there and shop, if no one is willing to go there and have their offices there, if no one is willing to go there and potentially live, those government programs are worthless, because you're going to end up with a project that, yeah, you may have gotten free land, you may have gotten all these incentives, but if the project doesn't make financial sense, it doesn't make financial sense. Okay? All right. Moving forward. Okay, capital structures.
I'm sorry, but what is now the interest tax sheet exactly?
Well, in this case, what we're saying is basically, what is your interest expense for a certain period of time?
Oh, it would just be that number.
Right. Okay.
Sorry.
So, when you go to start looking at, once again, whether or not you should borrow money as, obviously, an investor, developer, that sort of thing, one of the other things that you're probably going to be looking at, in addition to that interest tax shield or deduction that you may get, is also what benefits that you may be able to derive from a project's capital structure. In other words, from the benefits of borrowing, okay, would be another way to look at it. And so a typical, simple capital structure, and they call, and in many cases, they'll call these capital stacks, okay? And the reason is because you sort of stack one on top of the other to end up with your overall financing structure. But in this case, we would sort of say, okay, equity is down here at the bottom. Debt is, let's say, up here on top. And your equity might be 20% of your capital structure. The other 80% is debt. So obviously, the two of them together equal 100%. Now, as I said, this is probably the simplest of all capital structures. Well, actually, the simplest would be all equity, okay, where you're just basically putting in all of your own money, you're not borrowing any money. That would be the simplest, okay. This is probably the next most simple, or the most common, would be where you have a capital structure made up of debt and equity. Now, one of the things that we're going to infuse in this a little bit later is you can have more than one type of debt, okay? We can have sort of your primary debt, but we can also have what's called mezzanine debt, okay? Which we'll talk about as well. But right now, we're going to focus on these two basic sort of capital types, debt and equity, okay? Equity, very simply put, is the money that you personally are sort of contributing into the deal, okay? The money that you've got from your back pocket that basically you're throwing into the deal, cash money you've gotten from wherever to basically throw into a deal. Now, one of the things that you're going to be learning as we get deeper and deeper into this, especially in the investments course, is that money could be coming from sort of sweat equity. It could be coming from price appreciation and the value of the property and a variety of other sources. But we'll get into that later. Right now, let's say that we've got a project, and this is our capital structure. Now, our cost of debt normally is going to be lower than our cost of equity, okay? Because the general idea is we want to be able to go out, borrow money, and borrow money cheaply. And the cheaper we can borrow that money, with all the associated costs and fees and everything else, the cheaper we can get that money in the form of debt means we do what to our equity return? We increase it. Okay? So in this case, for simplicity, this is, once again, our capital structure, but let's say our cost of debt is, let's say, 5%. And our equity, this is what we would refer to as typically our return on equity. But our return on equity or our cost of equity, we might say is 15%. Okay, so if we sort of multiply these out, okay, so what we find by sort of calculating what our cost of debt is and our cost of equity or return on equity based in relative terms on the overall percentage contribution to our overall capital structure, what we find is that our overall cost of borrowing, or not cost of borrowing, our overall cost for our capital structure is 7%. So what that means is that the project overall has to return a 7% rate of return in order for us to basically meet the requirements of this particular capital structure. Okay, it needs to be greater than 7%. So if the overall project, as an example, let's say the overall project value is $100,000, then what does that really mean here? That means that 80% of that, or 80,000, is coming from debt, 20%, or 20,000, oops, not 200,000, finger, 20,000 coming from equity, and then overall, once again, 100,000 here. Well, another way to look at this is if you actually take the dollar amount and multiply it by the percentages. So what we get, you take 80,000 times 5%. So your cost of debt on an annual basis would be $4,000. And your cost of equity would be $3,000, or a total of $7,000. Well, once again, I'm just trying to kind of work around this so you can kind of begin to see the relationships. So basically what this is saying is that your project needs to generate $7,000 a year of income in order to satisfy your cost of debt and your cost of equity. So in this case, we take $7,000 and we simply divide it by the overall project value, we get 7%.
Can you repeat that? It needs to generate 7,000 to justify?
Well, yeah, I mean, okay. If you generate anything less than $7,000, what that's going to mean is then your equity people aren't going to get paid. Because you're going to pay your debt first, then you're going to pay whatever's left over, in essence, to your equity players. So what happens, let's say that in this particular case, instead of the project earning $7,000, and this is once again just the income that's generating each year, then let's say that that goes up to, I don't know, $8,000. Now this is a hypothetical. So assuming it goes up to 8,000, all right, we have to pay off our debt first, right? So we pay off our debt, we subtract out 4,000, that leaves us now with 4,000 for our equity. Well, if we're replacing basically the 3,000 with 4,000, and we sort of back solve into what that in essence is sort of saying to us, that if we still only have $20,000 basically of equity, and now we're getting 4,000, that's increased our rate of return from 15% on equity to 20%. Pretty cool, okay? In other words, it magnifies the rate of return significantly. You know, here we're talking about basically just going up from $7,000 to $8,000, but whenever we sort of back solve into this, what that means is now our return on equity has gone up from 15% to 20%, okay? All right. All right. Yep. Question?
Can you just do the 20,000, what did you do, 20,000 divided by 4,000 to get to the 20%, or what?
Okay. So we now have income of $4,000. We had invested $20,000. Oops. $20,000 of equity. So 4,000 divided by 20,000 is 20%. All right. Any questions on that? Okay. Now, as I said, one of the things that we will sort of be doing is, if we sort of think about this for a second, we said, okay, we've got equity down here, we've got traditional debt up here, but then we can also put in another piece, our mezz piece, or mezzanine debt, somewhere here in the middle. Now, normally, in this case, this might be, I don't know, let's say our debt goes down to 70%. Our equity stays at, let's say, 20%, and that leaves 10% for mezz financing, which we're going to explain here in a second. But normally, let's say our debt, stays constant at 5% cost, all right? Our mezz debt is usually going to be somewhere, now our original example was 15% for our equity, is usually going to be somewhere in between those two, okay? And so the mezz debt might be, I don't know, we'll just say 12%, all right? So if we were to go calculate out those, okay? So we've modified our capital structure now to insert a different sort of cost of capital in here. Now, in this case, this one doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense, except in the circumstances that we might be getting something special in terms of counseling or guidance from are mezzanine debt partners. Let's sort of talk a little bit about what the mezz debt actually is. So it's called mezzanine debt is the title. Okay? And what it refers to is kind of the in-between spot between kind of your equity and your debt, all right? So it kind of has some characteristics of equity, it has some characteristics of debt. For those of you with any sort of a finance background and you took like an intro corporate finance kind of, course, one of the things they talked about was probably preferred stock, okay? Mezzanine debt is very similar in some ways to preferred stock in that it kind of has these characteristics of both debt as well as equity. Now, what does that really mean, okay? What it means is that your mezzanine players are usually going to want to be active participants in your project in some way. In other words, they want to have some say-so in how the project gets built, how it gets marketed, how it gets structured, a whole number of things. And you're saying, well, first of all, why would you ever use mezzanine debt? Maybe you max out the amount of money that you can get in traditional debt. Maybe you have maxed out the total amount of money that you can get from your equity players. So the mezzanine player may be, in some cases, kind of the lender of last resort, or you can look at them as simply an extra sort of partner to bring into the deal that maybe has, once again, expertise that they may be able to offer, but in exchange for that, they want a higher rate of return than would ordinarily be the case for your debt player, but they don't have as much skin in the game as the equity player, so their return is going to be usually a little bit less. Now, if something goes wrong with the deal, okay, who gets hurt first?
The mezz lender.
No, the equity.
The equity. Then the mezz player, then the debt. In other words, so basically they're protected, okay, by the equity. So they're in a very enviable position. Now, what may be the case with a lot of mezz players, the role, and not in this particular example, but in a lot of examples, it may be that the mezz player allows you, as the equity player, to reduce the amount of equity or reduce the amount of capital that you have to put into the deal, okay? And, I mean, if you think about it, we could have, we didn't, but we could have, created another situation of where we said, okay, we've got equity, we've got mezz, and we've got debt. So it could have been, we still had the 80% that we originally had in debt, but now we've got 10% mezz, and we've dropped our equity down to 10% as well. So from that standpoint, the role of the mezz player in that capital structure would mean they're providing you the opportunity as the developer, as the investor, to not have to put in as much money as you ordinarily would. Does that make sense? Okay? Because most investors, developers are going to be, cash constrained.
But isn't the mezz debt subordinate to the lender?
Yes.
To the guy with 80%?
Yes. In other words, priority is the debt folks are the most protected. Mezz player is next, equity is last. Okay? So if anything goes wrong, equity player gets removed or reduced. Next will be mezz, next will be debt. So the mezz player, that's part of the reason why they want to insert themselves more in this process to try to get a higher rate of return, is because they may be putting themselves at more risk. Okay? Okay, does this make sense? Yes?
Yes, it makes sense, and that's the reason why I responded that they lose first, because equity guy loses what he puts in.
Yes.
But the mezz guy, he's out there on a limb with all this money that he's still a debt lender, even though he's perceived as equity in the deal. But the lender on the top of the stack with the 80%, he's well protected by both.
Right. Correct. Okay. Now, this whole thing about capital structure, that we just, once again, we're just kind of introducing this to you, is for you to begin to understand there's more than one way to finance a deal, okay? The traditional way to finance, well, once again, we say the simplest way to finance a deal, all cash, all equity, you got all the money, you just simply buy whatever you want, you write a check for it, you're done, you don't have to worry about borrowing any money, okay? That's simple. But most people don't have that luxury in terms of having all that extra cash sitting around, so they've got to borrow money. And so the question becomes, where do you borrow that money? Well, once again, the simplest is you go to a commercial lender, you get a traditional loan of whatever, 60, 70, 80% of the property's value. You put in the rest as equity, but once again, what happens if you don't have enough money to put in as equity? You either take on partners in terms of other investors that are sort of equals with you, or you involve someone like a mezz player that comes in and provides capital, but also will provide some additional guidance to you on this particular project because it's something maybe they're familiar with. But maybe they only provide mezzanine financing for certain types of deals, okay? Certain types of projects, yep.
Just curious, a mezzanine player wouldn't be like another bank, it would actually be like a...
It could be, but in many cases, it might be private equity, could be just someone looking for sort of joint venture. It could be some sort of fund that has been created specifically for that purpose. Indirectly, could be kind of almost even private equity to a certain extent of you've got individuals that are wealthy that simply they're looking to place money and they're willing to play the role of a mezzanine player. In other words, you could very easily be a mezz player. In the sense if you have the cash, you can play that role. There's nothing really fancy about the whole thing of a mezz player. The name is just meant to kind of imply it's sort of a middle ground. And where it gets its name, if you think about, especially old school hotels, you had a lobby, and then you had what? A mezzanine floor, which was kind of an in-between floor before then you would go on up to where the rooms were. Okay, and that's where it kind of gets its name, is it's kind of that in-between sort of,
Floor.
yeah. And so in this, circumstance, once again, you sort of start with equity, go to mezzanine, and then go to debt. Now, here's the thing.
The only question is always how much the mezzanine player is interfering into the project.
How much, I'm sorry, what?
He's interfering because
Yeah,
you say that they can
yes.
intervene, and
Yep.
how much
Yep.
actually they are going to.
And that, once again, totally depends on the mezzanine player. I mean, in other words, I could be a mezzanine player, you could be a mezzanine player, you could be a mezzanine player, anyone could be a mezzanine. And depending on what sort of agreement, that they strike, they could have literally no involvement, or they could be constantly, every check that gets written, they have to approve. Every, single significant decision about the property, they have to approve, okay? So that's what I'm saying, it totally depends. All we're really trying to focus on is, how does it fit? What's the general concept behind it, okay? Yep.
Did you say they were like a joint venture, mezzanine?
It can be. It can be. I mean, I don't want to get hung up on the specific legal entity that I mean, you guys can pepper, David Weissman and the law class all you want with all of those little nuanced sort of special purpose entity kind of, organizational structures and kind of who gets paid, when they get paid, how they get paid, all that sort of stuff. What I'm concerned with is more of, okay, who are the different players you have in your capital structure, and specifically what percentage have they contributed, and what is the payment they're going to receive? Okay, does that make sense?
It was basically his question.
Okay, so the next sort of iteration of this, we could have a MES 1 player, and we could have a MES 2 player, or MES 3, MES 4. We could also have a Debt 1 player and a Debt 2 player. Now what I'm trying to illustrate here, I'm not trying to make this more complicated than what it needs to be. I'm trying to illustrate where reality begins to kind of hit the road with this. You could also have a situation down here with the equity partners, even though this may only be 10%, you could have partner number 1, 2, 3, okay, or more. In other words, it is not out of the realm of possibilities, especially for large-scale, complicated sort of projects, to where you've got 5, 10, 15, 20 or more different players in this financing piece, okay? Now, the more complex it gets, the more challenging it sometimes gets to sort of manage the process, but there may be motivations for having it structured a certain way, okay? To appeal to, the different sort of players that are in that process, okay?
I have a question.
Yep.
So in the first example you gave us regarding tax rebates and credits, the tax credits would fall in the equity portion? Or is that outside of the capital step?
It's sort of outside the capital step, but what will happen is you will see in the investments course, which is really where we're going to get into that. That's where, depending on who has an equity stake in the project, they are going to typically be the beneficiaries of, like, tax credits. Everybody, in the sense of, well, the equity players are going to be beneficiaries of deductions and tax credits, but then also, once again, the thing that begins to complicate this is you can also sell your tax credits to other people, other investors. So it's kind of like if you're a relatively lower tax bracket income earner, there are many more folks out there that are probably in maybe a higher tax bracket, that the tax credit that you receive of $10,000 at a 28% tax bracket is not worth as much to someone that's in a 40% tax bracket and they get a $10,000 tax credit. Does that make sense? And so you can potentially sell off. So there's all different other aspects of this, okay? Right now, once again, all I'm really trying to do is just illustrate that, yes, you can have these multiple different players, and that just adds to basically the complexity of the financing sort of structure, the capital structure affiliated with it, okay?
All right.
We covered that. All right, so one of the other things that as we sort of were talking about these sort of interest expenses and things like that, is how that impacts your overall cash flow. So let's say that we've got a project that has income of $100,000 and we've got interest expenses of $30,000. So income, interest expense, so the remainder of our income is, let's say, 70,000. Yeah.
Is this a capital appreciation or cash flow return?
We're going to cash flow return.
Okay.
Okay. And so in this case, if we were to have a property where the overall value of the property is, let's say, $5 million. Oops. Well, that's probably a little bit high. Let's make that $3 million. Okay, so we've got a $3 million value of a property. And in terms of sort of the overall cash flow that we have, and specifically trying to get what is referred to as a cash on cash return. So we may have a property that's valued at $3 million, but of that $3 million, let's say $2 million is debt, leaving $1 million as equity. All right? So in this case, the cash on cash return would be taking that 70,000 and dividing it by the 1 million, since that's the equity portion of our investment. And we end up with 7% overall as a rate of return. Okay? So the cash flow return is very similar to what we have been, pretty much identical to what we've been going through when we start talking about return on equity. Same kind of thing, okay? In this case, we're sort of looking at a cash on cash return of after we have generated whatever income that we have, after we've subtracted out interest expense and gotten the benefit of that, then our actual cash flow sort of left over is 70,000, and then dividing that by whatever equity we have in the project is going to be sort of our cash on cash return. Now what you're going to be also seeing this sort of referred to is our before tax return on equity. Same thing. Okay, it's just another name for it. Okay? With cash on cash return, before tax return on equity, basically same thing. Okay? And the income that pretty much we're talking about here, this is going to be like our net operating income. This is going to be, once again, our interest. And then this is ultimately going to be like our before tax cash flow. Okay? And we'll make some modifications to that as we kind of go through, but at least for right now, that's what we need to focus on. Okay. Moving forward. Okay, this next piece, we've already talked about this, the mezzanine debt, or mezzanine finance. Trying to think if there's anything else on that I need to say. We've already done all of that.
Are we skipping over the capital appreciation?
We've already really done, it's been embedded in some of the other things we talked about.
Gotcha.
Okay. Okay, so another term that we've been sort of talking about is weighted average cost of capital, WACC. So, within the capital structure, depending on, you know, what the different sources are of capital, whether it's, once again, traditional debt, mezzanine debt, equity, and then other variations thereof, all of those combined equal basically our overall weighted average cost of capital. Now this is a term that we sort of, in real estate, we don't use this as much as the traditional finance people do in corporate finance, but it's the same thing. It's basically what is the overall sort of capital relative to the deal that we're doing. So if we go back, okay, so like this example that I gave here, our weighted average cost of capital is 7.7%. Okay, we have 3 different capital sources, 3 different basically apportionments of those types of capital, 3 different costs of those individual capitals. Then all we do is create a weighted average of those different sources of capital and how what their rate of return is to ultimately end up with the weighted average cost of capital. Does that make sense? So in other words, you kind of, excuse me, for the purposes of calculations, you kind of get a twofer, okay? Basically, you're just going to kind of go back through that same sort of process, okay? Being given sort of a source of capital, cost of capital, and then ultimately calculating a weighted average cost of capital. Okay, now we've got 1, 2, 3 brand new topics and then 1 additional sort of review. Okay, so this next one, incremental cost of borrowing. All right, this is a fun one, at least I think so. You go into a bank and you want to borrow money on a property that you want to invest in. And let's say that we have one bank that will give you a 70% sort of loan to value ratio, okay? So let's say that we've got a property that is $1 million in value. So that means that we can borrow 70% or $700,000 as our debt. Okay? And then, okay, so this is the scenario. So let's just say 12 payments per year, 700,000 is our present value. Okay, give me an interest rate.
4%.
4%. And give me a term.
15 years.
15 years. Okay, so let's start and get the payment. Okay, nothing is new at this point. Now, let's say that is lender number 1 that we have gone to. Lender number 2 says, hey, we will make you an 80% loan to value ratio. So this is lender 1. So lender 2 will give you an 80% loan to value. So that means 800,000 in debt. Okay, so let's kind of put this side by side. We're going to skip over the interest rate for a second. Term is going to be the same. Okay, and we'll have our payment. Now then, But here's the thing. Because they, the new lender, is taking on additional risk because they're giving you an 8% loan versus a 70% loan-to-value loan, they're going to charge you probably a higher rate of interest, okay? And so let's just say they charge you, I don't know, 6%. Okay? So let's calculate the payment for this. Okay. Now, before we go any further, let's try to let's make sure that you understand what's going on here, because this is an exceedingly, I would put this in like the top 5 most valuable lessons that you will get out of this. Okay. Which one of these loans would you prefer? And give me reasons why. And at this point, there are not going to be any absolute right or wrong answers. Right now, we're just trying to get you to think through this. Okay? Which one would you want and why?
Depends on how much money you need. So it depends on how much money you need.
Okay. Good way to start depends on how much money you need. So if I personally only have $200,000 of equity to put into the deal, I am, in essence, going to be forced to go to loan number 2, right? But if I have $300,000 or more in equity, I could easily do 1. Correct?
Yes, but you could also choose to do number 2 and use the other monies that you're not investing and investing in something else.
Right.
Okay, so there's, and that's a good way to think about it as well, is to what extent you could use the difference of the 100,000 between the two to possibly invest in something else. Okay? Good way to think about it. All right? Anything else? Any other sort of insights that you have about these 2 different alternatives?
I always think it's better the lesser payment, a lower payment.
Okay, yes, you have a lower payment, but yet you're borrowing less money. Over here, more payment, more money, but it's also got a higher interest rate. Okay, so, now one of the questions, or not one of the questions, but the question on this is what is referred to as what is the incremental cost of borrowing. So in this case, how much is it costing us to borrow the extra $100,000?
2%.
Okay, the first response, which unfortunately is wrong, is 2%. Okay, because think of it like this: you're paying 4% on 700,000. Here, you're paying 6% on an entire 800,000. Okay, so in other words, what we've got to do is, first of all, what is the difference between the 2 payments? Okay, let's start with that. $1,573 is the difference. Okay, so for that difference, I'm going to go ahead and just erase the difference because I want to, oops. Let me erase. There we go. Okay, so that difference, let's put that in as a negative payment. But in 15 years is our term. Okay? And put in 100,000, which is the difference between the two, as our present value. Now, this is where we're going to see what is that real incremental cost. of borrowing. Yeah. $17.48%. Now, this is where, we remember what I said about this being one of the most important concepts to understand. To the casual observer, it looks like you've got a 2% difference in your cost of borrowing between these two. But the reality is your true cost of borrowing for that extra 100,000 is actually 17.48%. So let me reframe the scenario here for a second. The ideal circumstance would now be, knowing this, would be to say, hey, I want to go to lender one, get that 700,000 locked down, then find an alternative source of capital just for the extra 100,000, like a mezz player. Okay, you see how this begins to tie in. So if I can find a mezz player that will loan me that extra 100,000 for something less than 17.48%, woohoo! I've scored, okay? And have a good deal. So even if the mezz player might cost me 10 or 12%, that's still less than the 17%. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay? But this is a problem that a lot of people fall into, because you can have a situation where, yeah, a lender will give you a higher and higher loan-to-value ratio, but in exchange for it, that true incremental cost of borrowing could be horrific. Okay? So that's the lesson to be learned. Okay? Any questions? Okay.
Dr. Forgan,
Yep.
in this instance where you're, essentially looking for mezz debt to cover that 100,000, depending on the deal, it would probably even work to go with an adjustable rate mortgage for it.
I'm sorry?
I said with this instance where you're going to find someone for the $100,000 separate, you could probably go with like an adjustable rate mortgage and it would still be cheaper than the 17% difference.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's the thing. There can be a lot of creative ways you approach the financing of a deal, okay? And sometimes it's that sheer creativity that can get you your money at a lower cost. But in some cases, it can also burden you with additional responsibilities, depending on what those additional players may want from the deal. Speaking as someone who's had a variety of different types of business partners over the years with different projects and that sort of thing, I'm not quite to the level of some people of, partners are absolutely horrific, but I will say it is tough in many cases to have partners on deals, especially equity partners, because there's always this situation of where, okay, we both have contributed maybe the same amount of money, but let's say that this equity partner is lazy and doesn't really do any work. This equity partner over here does a tremendous amount of work. This partner is somewhere in the middle and whatever. Sometimes reconciling, those sort of differences and being able for people to still talk to each other at the end of the day can be a real challenge, whenever you start involving many more players, okay? Because everybody's got a different perspective. And then, not to mention, the decision-making aspect of it, of you have one partner that wants to put in more money to make the project grander and more, amazing. Another partner is just saying, hey, let's keep it simple, generate a lot of cash flow, and another partner that's, doesn't really care. So all I'm saying is, it's wonderful for us to go through and to talk about and think about all of these different potentially complex sort of financial and deal structures, capital structures, that sort of thing, but then come back to the reality for a second, and the more people that you involve, also the more complex it gets with regard to kind of how you run and operate the project. Okay, it seems like common sense, and it sort of is, but sometimes I have seen a lot of people chasing deals that get partners just to try to get access to their money, and and if the project does exactly what it's supposed to do, everybody's happy, everything is wonderful, but the moment that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do, all insanity breaks loose, okay? Even with sometimes the best agreements. So just keep that in perspective. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so we're gonna now go back to one of the topics we had previously covered, but we're gonna make it more complicated.
Yay.
Adjustable rate mortgages, okay? All right, so how do you think we can make it more complicated?
Tying into a lever, having the rate change yearly or
Yes,
more?
yes, more frequently. Excellent, excellent choice. That's exactly where I was going. So, in this case, we can do this a couple of different ways. Let me just see. Did I do this? Yeah, okay. We're going to keep it somewhat simple. We're going to do annual payments, okay? Just to keep things simple. So, to illustrate the process. All right. So, what's going to be our introductory teaser rate for the first year?
1.5%.
Okay, so we're going to say year one is going to be 1.5%. Okay, what about for year two?
3%.
3%? Okay. Let's just say years 3 and 4 are going to be what? Give me a number.
4.
6.
6, I like 6. Bigger number. Okay. Now then maybe years 5 through, I don't know, 10.
2.2.
What?
Woo, no.
What'd you say?
I think you said 2.2.
Okay.
No, do something else.
Let's do 7.2. Okay. All right. And we'll stop it there. Okay. Now, so we got a 10-year adjustable rate mortgage. Oops. Adjustable rate mortgage. With a 10-year term, obviously the rates adjust a few times. Okay. Now, give me the dollar amount for the loan. Something with nice round numbers.
$1 million.
200,000.
Okay, 200,000. All right, so off we go. All right, so we start off one payment per year. And we're going to have 200,000 as our loan amount. Our initial interest rate is 1.5%. And our loan term overall is 10 years. So we have to start with. And then we get our first year's payment. Okay, so the first year, if we're doing annual, 21,686.84. Now, this next piece, while you've seen it sort of before, I'm going to work through it fairly quickly, and then I'm going to go back and try to explain what I did, okay? Try to see if you can do it on your own, okay? Because all you're going to be doing is basically changing the interest rate. You're going to find the balance, change the interest rate, find the new payment, find the new balance, change the interest rate, new payment, new term, you know, and so forth, so on. All right? So, first thing, okay, let's get our balance. Okay, now if you kind of sort of remember, you know, from the previous problems that we kind of worked on this, what do? This amount becomes our new present value. Okay, then we go in, we put the new interest rate, 3%. Okay, our new term is now what? 9 years remaining. Okay. Then find the new payment. And this is where we had stopped, okay, with previous examples of adjustable rate mortgage. Okay, so now let's continue the process. And that payment, now this is where you're going to make a mistake. So I'm going to try to help you out here. Okay, you've got to look at this every time we adjust the interest rate. Listen to me on this, write this in your notes. Every time you adjust the interest rate, pretend it is a brand new loan, okay, with a new term, a new interest rate, and a new payment. Once again, write this in your notes. Every time the interest rate changes, pretend it is a brand new loan with a new interest rate and a new term and ultimately a new payment. Okay, so we have changed the interest rate. We have changed, obviously, the dollar amount of the loan. We have changed the term now to reduce it by 1 year, since 1 year's been paid. So now this is our payment for year 2. So we're kind of, if we were keeping sort of track of this in any way, this would have been our sort of our payment for year 1. This is our payment for year 2, right? Okay. Now, we're going to do 1 input 1. You're saying, wait a second, didn't we just do 1 input 1? Yes, but what did I say? Treat it as if it's a brand new loan, because now you've got 9 years remaining, so the year that we're concerned with is the first year for the remaining 9 years, okay? This is where the logic comes into play. Okay, so if you want to sort of think about it, this is up here, balance at end of year 1. This is balance at end of year 2. Okay, so we put that in as our present value. Then our next interest rate is 6%. How many years remaining now? 8.
But you go like clear all after the present value? Or before? Like
Once again, you just put the present value, and then you just continue on with the change of the interest rate and change of the term. Okay. Okay, so the new payment, $26,000. It's going up, not down, because obviously interest rate's going up. Okay? Now, this, once again, is kind of a nice little trick. How long do we make this payment for?
One input, 2
years.
2 years. Okay, so yes, 1 input, 2. This is where the logic you start to really have to kind of apply. This is going to be one of the first problems that you really have to sort of kind of aggressively think through the logic. So this is going to be the balance at end of year 4. Okay, and that becomes present value. And with our next one, 7.2% interest rate. And how many years is this?
6.
Okay, so does everybody see that? Okay. Okay, and we get our payment. $27,324.49, and then here, just to sort of check things out, we don't have to do this, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it. 1 input, 6 shift, amortize, equal, 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 and we get 0, which is what we should get.
And
Okay.
you can do it individually though too, can you? I mean, instead, you did it as one calculation, continually one calculation.
Correct.
Okay.
I mean, you could break apart each of these, separate them out, you know,
Right,
as
right.
individual components, but since we're replacing each of the variables, we're able to kind of continue on as long as we're replacing the key variables. Okay? And so this would be the balance at end of year 10. Okay? Now, okay, that's the first part of the problem. Okay? The second part of the problem is to calculate what is the lender's yield on this particular loan. In other words, what is the actual interest rate the lender is receiving on this loan? And so to do that, we have to set it up as cash flows. Okay? All right? So the way that's going to look, one payment per year. This would be, you know, once again, a brand new problem, or part of the problem. All right? And then we start off with the lender has given us $200,000. So from the lender's perspective, it's an outflow. So we're making that the cash flow. Then the first year's cash flow that the lender is going to receive is $21,686.84. Then they're going to receive $23,286.75. Then they're going to receive $26,323.87. Now we could just put that in twice, or we could put the 2 shift in sub j. Either way is fine. We're going to just put in twice. And then they're going to receive $27,324.49 as a cash flow. How many times?
6.
6. So we can put that in as 6 shift in sub j. And then just a matter of solving for basically the internal rate of return, or in this case, the lender's yield. All right? So let's see what we get.
Why did we put 26,000 twice again? I didn't hear you.
Because it happens twice.
For 2 years.
Years 3 and 4.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay? So you should get 5.027% as the lender's yield. So, for all those changes in interest rates, it's basically, in essence, it's really a weighted average for all things considered, but we're just saying with those interest rates, the reality is the lender is getting about a 5% interest rate over that 10-year life of that loan. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Yes or no? Now, we're not going to do it now. We're probably going to do it later. Not necessarily today, but later. How could we make this more complex?
Increase the frequency more?
Sure, okay, but outside of changing the interest rate, what else could we modify?
Term.
We could modify the term, but outside of that, what else can we modify?
The rate.
Okay, we're modifying the rate. What else can we modify, though? You're missing. What else could we do to make this more complicated that we went over last week in class?
Multiple loans?
Okay, we can do that. That's still not what I'm looking for. What else can we do? to make
Changing the payment structure so that,
Prepayment penalty.
Yes!
Look back at my notes.
Okay, so,
trying to say that.
so one thing we could do is have a prepayment penalty. Now this loan is obviously paid off at the end, so there wouldn't be one, but we could obviously have a prepayment penalty that would be attached to this. We could also have loan origination fees. We could also have basically any sort of interim kind of administrative fees. All of that could be basically embedded within this, okay? So the point that is this is beginning to get to the point of where instead of using the calculator, you're going to begin to want to probably use Excel, okay? Which we will do, okay? But I think it's important that you get the calculator stuff first before you sort of jump into Excel and then you have no clue about what you're really doing otherwise. Okay, does this make sense to everybody? Yes? Bob heads up and down, even in Zoom land. Okay, good. All right.
In the interpretation in these, your Zoom, when it has when it's interpreted, it says what's going on in New Zealand or something.
Well, that works. Okay. Which is kind of interesting because I taught in New Zealand for 3 years. So, not that it means anything, but it's just kind of an interesting coincidence. Okay. Moving on. Okay. Plans. Price level adjusted mortgages. All right. If you remember, one of the things I was just talking about, this whole thing of being creative with your financing and that sort of thing. Well, that goes both ways, in the sense that you, as a borrower, as a developer, investor, you get creative with how you have your sources of capital and how they all get structured, that sort of thing. But on the lender side, believe it or not, these folks can get very creative with the types of loans that they will produce, come up with, utilize, some of which will kind of be used for a while and then kind of tossed away for one reason or another and not really utilized as much. But what is important to understand is the more that you can understand how a lender thinks, the more that you can understand the options available to a lender, you can begin to then start piecing together a loan product that will achieve maybe what it is you're trying to achieve as a lender, but then you as the developer investor having a much better understanding of the complexity that lenders have at their disposal, okay? So, yes, I try to joke about it, in the sense of, oh, let's make this more complex. Well, I joke about it only from the standpoint, it's not that it's not important, it's extremely important, but it's not that I am trying to make this more complicated just to make it more complicated. I'm trying to show you the incremental steps that you can go to, or a lender can go to in essence, complicate up a deal that you hopefully will have a better chance of now understanding that you wouldn't have had before. Does that make sense? But you don't start by trying to explain the most complex product that a lender has to offer. You start with trying to explain the simplest product they have to offer and then complicating it up as we sort of go through. Does that make sense? Okay? Now at some point, you may just sort of say, I give up, I'm tired of this complexity. I'm tired of trying to understand, where all this is going and what this is all about. You can't do that. You've got to look at what the end game is. The end game is for you to understand this with enough level of detail so that you can begin to tear apart some of these things on your own and respond to them as they're thrown in your direction. Okay, that's the simplest way I can put it. And sometimes it's not easy to just pick this up from reading something. Sometimes you need someone to explain it to you, and that's hopefully what part of my role is here. Okay, so this is one of those kinds of products that a lender or lenders came up with quite a while back, okay, back in the 1970s. And their motivation for coming up with it, before I explain what it does, was to deal with a pretty much singular issue, inflation. And they wanted to offer a product, this is very simple, with a lower than normal interest rate. Write this down. They wanted to come up with a product with a lower than normal interest rate, but a product where they, as the lender, would in essence participate in the upward inflationary value of the property. Okay? So try to wrap your head around that for a second.
Can you say the second part again?
Okay.
Where the lender...
So the lender is trying to create a product for the market. Keep in mind, the market is people looking to get loans. And as what we have talked about, whenever a lender is offering a low interest rate loan compared to all of the other competitors, there's usually a string attached. The string attached to this is the lender gets to participate in the upward inflation-driven value of the property. In other words, as the value of the property goes up over time during the loan, you owe more on the property. Does that make sense? So what you may have started out with as a loan for $100,000, the lender is saying, hey, inflation is really high, maybe 5% a year, so instead of us just making you a loan with a high interest rate, what we're going to do is make you a lower interest rate loan to get you in the door, but we are going to adjust the balance of your loan each year according to inflation. So, think about it like this, very simply put. They charge you maybe let's say a 2% interest rate, low interest rate, but they say, we're going to charge you whatever the inflation rate is for this first year on the balance of your loan. So if you borrowed $100,000 and you, let's just say that you still owe $100,000 to keep the math simple, you still owe $100,000 at the end of the first year, what they're going to do is they're going to say, okay, inflation is 5%. Okay, instead of owing us $100,000, you now owe us what? 105,000. Okay? Next year, inflation goes up again by another 5%. Now you owe them roughly 110,000. You follow me? Okay? So it's yet another sneaky way for the lender to, in essence, get more money, higher rate of return out of you as the borrower. You still think, woo, I'm getting a great deal because my interest rate's low, but yet you're looking at your balance on your loan at the end of each year and you're saying, why does my loan balance keep going up? Well, it's because you've got a price level adjusted mortgage. Okay? So let's explain sort of how it works.
Is this the one that Max was talking that's connected to the LIBOR rate?
It can be.
Oh.
Yeah. Or some sort of, it could be a LIBOR rate, could be a consumer price index, could be just a general rate of inflation, could be, the lender's going to specify up front in the loan documents what they're specifically going to tie it to. And then each year, it gets adjusted based upon whatever that particular rate is. Okay? So,
I have a question, sir.
Yep.
So, assuming that this is assuming there's inflation. Now, in a market where, for example, maybe there wasn't, maybe there was, maybe value, there was loss in value.
Sure.
Would they...
No, it could work both ways, depending on the agreement.
Is it set somewhere like a fine print that it would just keep it the same, or would it go down as well?
No, it could go down. But, once again, it all depends on the language of the loan documents. Okay? And so, some lenders, and again, here's another thing that you also have to keep in the back of your mind. And maybe I haven't done a good job of trying to articulate this. In your mind, a lender is Wells Fargo, is Bank of America, is, name any other bank out there, okay, that is what you think of as a lender. A lender could be me. A lender could be you. So, as an example, let's say that I own a property free and clear. I had bought the property either with cash or I've owned it long enough, I own it free and clear. I could very easily become a lender to whoever the purchaser is. In other words, I could seller finance, okay, or owner finance. And so I could come up with a wide variety of structural products that would meet my needs that might be different than what a traditional lender might do, but once again, it serves what my specific interests are and my specific, objectives are. And so, the whole thing of automatically sort of saying, okay, is Wells Fargo doing these right now? No, they're not. Haven't done them in probably a number of years. Are there people doing these? Yes, there are. Okay, but they may not be traditional lenders. Okay. All right. So, but the simple answer to your question, what I was trying to, I guess, answer was, yes, you could have it structured where there is a floor and the value would not fall below the floor. It could be that the value could go down, excuse me, dramatically if the market does, actually deteriorate. Or, it could be that once again, once it's achieved a certain level, it never goes down. So it's very possible. Okay, so let's just say at the end of year one, that inflation, I don't know, like I said 5%, let's just go with that. 5%, at the end of year one, the balance gets increased. Maybe at end of year two, it goes to 3%, upward. End of year three, let's say 6%. Okay, give me
Now, those percentages, are they inflation or is that just the rate?
inflation.
Okay.
Now, these are not the interest rates of the loan. These are the inflation rates. I'll write it up here, inflation. Okay. So give me a term of the loan. How many years?
Let's do 15.
15. Okay. And we'll make this, no, we can do it monthly. Okay. Monthly interest rate. Okay. So we said 15-year term. Okay, what's our interest rate going to be? We said we were going to charge maybe a roughly low interest rate, so let's just go, I don't know, 2%. Okay, and then the loan amount, to keep it simple, $100,000, because you can kind of begin to see what impact it actually has. Oops, not present. It's present. And solve for payment. Okay. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the screen, nothing is new. Same old stuff, 15-year mortgage, 2% interest rate, $100,000 loan amount, payment, $643.51, okay? Now, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna make adjustments to the loan balance at the end of each of these years to basically raise it. Now, here's another way to look at this. This is one of the reasons I still include this problem, because hopefully some of you begin to then draw the connection between something else that we've talked about. To a certain extent, in terms of mathematically and computationally, these adjustments that we're making to the balance at the end of each of these periods is similar to what?
A reverse mortgage?
No! Okay, give me your answer, Adam. Same answer as before.
Prepayment penalty.
Prepayment penalty, okay? Okay, because in essence, that's what the adjustment that you make to the balance is very much like the adjustment you make to the balance of a loan that gets prepaid, okay? Same concept, but it's different, okay? So, we come back over here, we say, okay, one, input 12, first 12 months. We get the balance. Then, what we're going to do, once we get that balance, process-wise, you're going to multiply that balance times 1.05.
05.
Yeah, because it's 5%.
Yep.
That is going to give you the new sort of new balance. Okay, so let's start with that.
That 1.05, that 5% is from where coming? Oh, it's the
The
inflation
inflation.
rate?
Okay, we get 94, 225, 15 times 1.05. Okay, so just to make sure that you're kind of paying attention, you're thinking about what's actually happening. So if you were to go to the lender right now and say, hey, I want to stop this madness, I want to get out of this loan, how much would you owe them?
98,000.
98,000.
And then hopefully some prepayment penalty.
Right. Okay? Now, so what this now becomes is your new present value, but then we got to adjust the term to 14 years.
Can you just push PV now?
Yes. Okay. Now, with this, your interest rate is staying constant, yes?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so we don't have to change the interest rate. We keep that at 2%. So you've changed the term now down to 14. The loan amount's been changed. So what we're left with doing is saying, okay, well, what's our new payment? Okay, so our new monthly payment has gone up by about $30 a month as a result of this. Okay? So another way to sort of think about this, just from the, once again, kind of from the lender's point of view, the lender's not giving you any more money. But what you're doing is basically saying, you owe them more money. Okay? You follow? So they're getting money one way or another. It's just how they're going about to get it. Okay, well now we kind of rinse and repeat the process. So now that we've sort of started things over again, another 12 months.
Do you multiply the balance by the 3%?
Yes.
Oh, okay. But not,
So in this case are
no, I see.
3%.
Okay. I was doing it earlier.
Okay, same process, make that your new present value. Now we're down to 13 years. Okay. Okay, so we've gotten to this point. You're saying, obviously, your payment is increasing at the end of each of these years. Now, we're going to do it one more time. This time it's going to go up by 6%. Okay, that becomes a new, oops. 94, 374, 74, present value, just for 12 years. And we get the payment of what?
737.71.
Yep. Okay. So, now, we can approach the remainder of this a couple different ways. One is we can just sort of stop there and say, all right, let's just say that we pay off this loan basically at the end of, let's say, year 3. So this would be end of year 3, end of year 2, oops, end of year 1. So one way we could approach this is say, okay, well, what if we were to pay off the loan at end of year 3? We don't really then need this sort of calculation here, if that's what we're sort of asking for. So you pay off the loan at the end of year 3. What is the lender's yield? Okay, so I'm going to just see if you can figure it out on your own. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes. By now, you should have the logic to be able to kind of work through this. So what I want to know is what the lender's yield is, assuming you pay off this loan at the end of year 3. You're going to have to use cash flows. After we finish this, we'll take a break. We've got one more problem to complete. you're gonna add the final one to the final payoff.
You got 6.34. Anybody else get 6.34?
Nope.
Okay, there's the setup. So let me put it in.
So yeah, because I'm thinking we have a 15-year term, so.
No, keep in mind we're paying it off after 3 years.
Gotcha.
And you have to change it to the one payment per year, right?
Nope.
Nope.
So do you include the 4 payments or just the 3 payments?
No, okay. These are the payments for year 1. These are the payments for year 2. These are the payments for year 3, along with this final payment at the end of the year, plus the payoff at the end of year 3.
So would it have been possible to make like annual payment and make this
No,
payment times 12?
6.34.
Like each of them
No, you can't, because it wouldn't be properly,
calculated?
yeah. Okay, let me punch it on myself. Basically 3.4. So, what little lesson do we learn there? The stated interest rate was 2%. So because of the nature of the price level adjusted mortgage, the lender was able to squeak out an extra basically 4.3% on top of what they would have been getting with the standard normal interest rate. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, so once you got that, go ahead and take about a 5-minute break.
So what happened with the 737?
We don't need it, because that's year 4. We're paying it off at the end of year 3.
Oh, at the end of.
My decimal point is only 1. I've been screwing
Okay,
up.
shift
Yeah,
equal 9.
I've been shift 9, and I shift equal 9.
And because you're making that last payment in year 3, that's the reason why you're using 11, and then you're combining the last payment with the balance remaining.
That is correct.
So this is very much like that reversion problem.
You stepped outside.
Okay.
Hey Adam,
Yo.
did you try to hit me up in text messages last week?
I don't think so.
Okay, alright, it wasn't you.
Unless it was like my ass dialing you.
No. I don't know who else would have my number. Somebody texted me before class but didn't give a name.
Oh, that's weird.
They won't give a name, or they didn't?
Dr. Forty.
Yep.
That last problem kind of solved just like we did the reversion problem, correct?
We say reversion. Are you talking about what?
In the previous problems that we've done, where we had the sale period.
Yep. In that aspect of it, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Fordy, will we be able to see which questions we got wrong on the midterm, just so we can go back and see?
The what, I'm sorry?
Will we be able to see which questions we got wrong on the midterm?
You should be able to log in and see them.
Mine still says it's not accepted. I can see my grade, but I can't see the quiz itself.
Same here, Doc.
Okay, good to know.
So after you had stepped out, one of the guys said, it's like the reversion, so that's why I was getting lost on the 11.
Yeah.
It's just basically, all you're doing is just,
Okay.
it's just adding in the final cash flow, basically from the perspective of the lender.
Right, with the balance. Okay.
Correct.
I got you.
So the yield, I missed a step, but the yield is 6.3399%, correct?
Correct.
Okay, it had 2% circle and 22.
No, the 2% is just simply what their stated rate of interest was. And I was just simply saying that you think as a borrower, you're getting a 2% interest rate, when the reality of it is it's costing you really 6.34%.
Okay, I got you.
In about, one more minute, we'll get started. And we've still got, don't we still have somebody, maybe yes, maybe no? Is this it?
For ink class, I think that's.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I thought there was one more person out there working. Okay. All right, everybody in Zoom land, wake up, we're still here. All right, so, the last little topic for, at least for the quiz, that sort of thing, is the idea of how below market financing, below market cost financing can impact the property's value. Okay, so here's what I mean by this. Let's say we have a property out there, once again, we'll go ahead and do this, 12 payments per year. $500,000 property, and let's say 20-year term. 20-year term, and the prevailing rate of interest in the market, let's say right now, is 7%. Okay, so let's go ahead and calculate our monthly payment. Okay, so if we want to buy this property, this is the loan that we would get, and the term we would get, and the payment we would have. okay, under ordinary circumstances. Okay, is everybody cool with that? Nothing unusual, just simply saying these are the market conditions. All right? Now, let's say that the seller of the property owns the property free and clear. And they're willing to do basically an owner finance or seller finance deal with the prospective purchaser. So, just hypothetically, let's say it's me, all right? So I own this property, I have priced it at $500,000, and I'm willing to sell it for $500,000. You go get bank financing, that's great. But what if I actually want to potentially create a scenario where I don't want all of the money coming to me right now? In other words, I don't want you just paying me $500,000 through a bank loan. Obviously, I'll get my loan, or I get my proceeds. I'll just walk away. What if I don't want that? What if I, as the seller, say, it'd be really nice to basically sell this property to this person for the $500,000, and I'm going to give them a heck of a deal. I'm going to give them a deal that basically for 5% interest rate for the next 20 years. And you're saying, why would I do that? Maybe what I want is continuous cash flow. That maybe I want to look at it as almost like a retirement fund. That for the next 20 years, I can just be collecting money from the person I'm selling the property to. Doesn't that sound like a good deal? Potentially? Okay. And to the purchaser, they're saying, woo, that's a great deal because that's a lower interest rate. And they don't have to maybe go through all the brain damage, associated with getting an appraisal, getting inspections, doing all that, unless they want to, So you're saying, okay, what's the downside? Well, depending on how the deal is structured, it could be kind of almost like a lease to own, so that instead of actually transferring title, I retain the title and we do kind of like a contract for deed that until you make your final payment 20 years from now, you don't actually have your name on the deed of the property. That's one thing that could potentially happen. Another is I could go ahead and sign over to you and ultimately, some sort of deed of trust arrangement, whatever, to allow me to do a quicker sort of foreclosure process in the event that you don't pay me. But for the most part, it's a pretty good deal. Well, and it is. But there's also some additional value in there as well. Okay, and here's what I mean. I want you to think about this. So I'm offering it at a 5% interest rate, so we're just going to replace the interest rate, solve for the new payment here for a second. All right, let's look at the difference between these two. All right, so everybody can see that by me offering you this lower interest rate, I'm saving you $576.71 a month for the next 20 years. Yes?
Yep.
Okay. So just for fun, okay, 20 years times 12 is what? 240 payments, correct?
Yep.
So I have, in essence, saved you, out of pocket, $138,400 $470.71 over the 20-year period by charging you less in interest than you would have with a traditional bank. Yes or no? Okay. Now, good news for you, that's where I'm stopping the problem on the quiz. Okay? But I want to work a little further in this and to see kind of what this does to the overlying value of the property. Okay? Because think about it like this. Put yourself in the shoes of the purchaser. Put yourselves in the shoes of the seller. In addition to what I have already kind of talked about, what would be some of the potential cost and benefits associated with this deal?
Tax.
Okay, there could be some tax implications in the sense that I, as the seller of the property, may not have to pay capital gains tax as quickly. I can kind of spread it out over multiple years. That might be one motivation. But what else does this... Okay, go ahead. Somebody out there?
Yep, smaller debt service and larger cash flows.
Okay, smaller debt service for the borrower. Absolutely. Anybody else?
Well, the seller, the interest is, I mean, not the interest, but if the buyer does not end up paying the full amount, like in the middle, then he gets the property back and can sell it
Okay,
again.
yep. So, yeah, if all of a sudden the borrower defaults, depending on how the deal is structured, it may be a non-judicial foreclosure, meaning that the seller can get the property back, sell it again, okay? If they don't fulfill the obligations of the deal, okay?
So does the 138 become like a balloon payment?
No, it's not so much it becomes a balloon payment because this is just simply, all we're saying is this was a bank loan,
Right.
this is the seller financing.
Oh.
So it's kind of like it's an either-or proposition.
Okay.
So the buyer is also saving additional money besides the payment where they don't have to pay funding fees and administrative
Sure, all of the
fees.
other transactional costs
Right.
are pretty much, for the most part, thrown out the window,
Yeah.
okay?
But Dr. Foley, let me ask you a question. So the true effect would be if someone comes in and undercuts the market, it would drive the market values up, right?
Okay. Yes, to a certain extent. And that's what I want to talk about. So, by doing this, by me coming in and offering this sort of a deal, we all agree it has value to the purchaser. Yes? We're at unanimous agreement, it has value to the purchaser.
Yep.
Everybody agree with that? Yes?
138 does.
Okay. But if we want to look at it another way, if I, as the seller, want to be maybe, I don't know, a little bit greedier or a little bit, I want to maybe get more for this than otherwise might be able to, what I could do is I could say, well, you know what? I may give you this lower interest rate, but in exchange for that lower interest rate, I want a higher price on the property.
Appraisal value.
And so, think about that for a moment. I'm twisting it, contorting it. So that I'm saying now as the seller, I'm okay with giving you a lower interest rate, but I want more for the property than $500,000. Okay? So what if this were what would normally be traditional market value? This is where it gets interesting. What if this were what the traditional market value is? But what I'm saying is, now that you understand this deal, what if I come in as the owner and say, you know what? I want $550,000 for the property. But I'm still willing to give you 20-year loan at the lower interest rate of 5%. So let's take a look at what that does.
Still a lower payment, 3629.
It is. $36,29.76. So that's still a couple $100 lower than what I had previously. Okay? Now, there's a method to my madness in terms of going about this and explaining this the way that I have, and trying to change up the scenario a little bit. And let's say that you accept this deal from me. You're willing now, because you're saying to yourself, okay, I don't care. I mean, yeah, I'm paying $50,000 more than I would have, but yet my payment is still substantially less than what it would have been. Okay? So all things considered, I'm still out less money than I would have been with a traditional bank loan. You follow my logic? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is the part where it gets ridiculously interesting. You're a developer. You have a few hundred properties, whether they're townhomes, condos, houses. You offer this below market financing at a higher than normal value for the property. You have effectively set the price point for the properties higher than what normal market value would be. And those sales go through. They're now being used as comparable sales by subsequent purchasers. And so you have created potentially a tremendous amount of additional value, that if you've got 500 units, that instead of being able to sell them for $500,000 a unit, you're being able to sell them at $550,000 a unit. You're selling them because you've, in essence, manipulated the market value of those properties within your portfolio to a higher value. Now,
hey sir, that was kind of my question, because I figured since this was seller financing, it wasn't being, I mean, I know it's being recorded, but it's essentially a negotiation, a deal between an individual and another individual, as opposed to, so I was thinking, was it recorded in some way that would raise the value of that property? Because, yeah, in a sense, he could ask for a lot more, and that's a huge,
right.
That's it.
No, and that's why I'm explaining it this way, because if I explained it that way from the very beginning, it wouldn't make as much sense. Now you're hopefully beginning to say, ooh, this sounds interesting, okay?
Yeah.
Because, now here's the thing. Developers do this all the time, okay? They make their first units at the highest price point they can make them, because subsequently every future unit that sells is going to be dependent upon those initial sales, because that's where the market has been set. So the developer, in many cases, is trying to strongly influence the value of those initial unit sales. Now, having just said everything I just said, did anybody do anything wrong? Okay, that's where it also begins to be a little questionable, okay? Because the intent on the part of the developer, in this case, was to potentially manipulate the value upward. In other words, create kind of a false value for the property by offering this sort of below market financing. They did nothing wrong in terms of below market financing. There's nothing wrong with that. But one has to begin to question a little bit, or maybe a lot, depending on where you want to draw the line. You know, but what should happen as a matter of practice, if you have appraisers, real estate appraisers, third-party appraisers, that are doing their job and that actually are getting out there and investigating, you know, these sales to ensure that they're truly arm's length transactions and that they're not some sort of voodoo that has been created by the developer to try to manipulate the price points. You know, hopefully this sort of thing may get caught. But what I'm saying is, and I am in no way, and I'm being recorded, am I saying this is behavior that people should engage in. I am saying this is what happens in many instances by developers of properties to try to move that price point in a significant way. They'll do all kinds of other things too. They'll, like, maybe, you know, especially the residential side of things, that they'll say, all right, the first few houses, we're going to sell them fully furnished, knowing full well that they've put $10,000 or $15,000 worth of furniture in there or more, and that's going to inflate the price. But they don't separate out in the sales contract that it's house plus furniture. They just simply say house. And then because it has furniture in it, it yields a higher price. Now they've got their price point sort of set at a higher level, potentially for future sort of sales. Does that make sense? Now, I would expect, or would hope, that you would have some questions about this.
Well, the verse can also hold true if people sell property under the market.
Sure.
They could drive it.
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, that's probably one of the biggest mistakes that a developer can make, is allowing their first few units to sell at a deep discount. Now, you know, what some developers will do is, yeah, they'll do pre-construction pricing and things like that, you know, and then they have to go back and kind of explain, yes, we sold it at a lower than normal value because it was pre-construction priced, but then they got to, in essence, kind of do some backfill to try to then, you know, explain to the market why they're worth so much more now that they've been actually built, okay? Which, you know, really, it shouldn't matter other than, you know, okay, yeah, but in terms of the risk of it being pre-construction versus post-construction, there's really no inherent risk on the part of the purchaser.
From a macroeconomics point of view, though, wouldn't this create cyclical bubbles in the housing real estate market?
Yes. All the time.
Create what? I'm sorry.
Bubbles.
Bubbles.
Because you've got an imperfection in the pricing. You know, this is the sort of thing that you don't want to have happen. But it happens all the time, okay? Because everybody is looking for some way to potentially manipulate the system, game the system, you know, and come up with a way to obviously, because getting that extra 50 grand, once again, that could be huge, you know, on the scale of a project that, you know, instantly, boom, you're just printing money.
Yeah, I was going to say, because I was thinking about it, if you had 500 units, like you said before, and you basically up the price to $50,000, you're adding $25 million to what you had.
Because here's part of the problem, and this is this is like a new thing. Much of real estate value on the residential side, not on the commercial side, on the residential side, is driven by one thing: perception. And what a person perceives is the value of something is what drives that value. Now, you can try to get it all down to, it's based on square footage, it's based upon the number of bedrooms and bathrooms, it's based upon the location, it's based upon the view, it's based upon the school district, it's based upon all this other stuff, and you can try to put all that stuff into a fairly complex valuation model, that, like what we would call a hedonic pricing model, and you have all that stuff kind of thrown in there to try to spit out what the value of the property should be for an appraiser. But at the end of the day, it could just very well be you walk into a property and you say, woo, I'm amazed by this. I think it's amazing. I'm willing to pay $50,000 more than everybody else because it suits whatever your needs, issues, are. Versus somebody else may walk into the same exact property and they think it's worth $50,000 less than what they're asking for the property. And is there any good rhyme or reason to that? Now, once again, yes, you're still going to have an independent third-party appraisal done on the property, but that just simply does not capture every single possible component of the property. Does that make sense? Now, on the commercial side, much less emotional, much more all about the numbers, all about the square footage, all about the finish out, all about basically the locational attributes that are going to be making this retail property valuable, or this office property valuable, or this industrial property valuable, and far less emotion, far less driven by all these other sorts of things. Okay. All right. Other questions?
Now, when
Does this affect the cap rate at all, or?
Okay, good question. Does it affect the cap rate? And to a certain extent, it may have an influence on it because, once again, you could be saying these properties are worth more than what they really are, and then how is that, assuming it's an income-producing property, if the value is going up and the income is staying constant, then the cap rate's going to do what? Well, the cap rate's going to go down a little bit because you're sort of perceiving a little bit less risk associated. We're willing to pay more for that same cash flow. Now, if in addition to this, dollar amount going up, you also have a corresponding increase in the income, then the cap rate could stay the same. Or you have more income than proportionate, the cap rate obviously could go up even more. So, does it, directly impact? It depends on the relationship to what the underlying income property generates.
I was just thinking of the developer side. That's only possible if they don't have a construction loan, or the construction loan must be less than the lower market financing.
Okay, the construction loan, to a certain extent, is irrelevant. I mean, in terms of the dollar amount of the construction loan, because people aren't buying a property based on the construction loan. They're buying a property based upon whatever the price point.
No, but in terms from the developer, he has to finance it also. So if he has the construction loan for 7% and then sells the property for 5%, then
well, okay, but keep in mind what I was arguing. This is about someone that owns a property free and clear.
okay.
Okay. All right. Other questions? Stacy, it looks like you're trying to say something, but you're muted. Okay.
So just to be clear, Dr. Ford just said we can price manipulate.
The what, I'm sorry?
So just to be clear, Dr. Ford just said we can price manipulate.
No, I did not say that. I said this is, in many cases, how it is done.
That we can manipulate the price as much as we want.
Doesn't mean you're going to sell it either.
Right. Okay. Now, before we leave this completely, but another, just kind of going back to kind of the original scenario here, it also could be the situation, one of the additional reasons why you can maybe get more money for it. What if the person you're selling it to has bad credit?
Yeah.
They can't get the normal loan, okay, that the market would be normally giving. And there's nothing to really say that you even have to give them a discount. I mean, if we go back to the original scenario, that you could even go so far as, flip it and sort of say, that's not what we were dealing with, but I mean, you could, as a seller, let's say that we've got a borrower, they've got horrible credit, I could say, the bank won't lend to you, but I will, and I'm going to charge you a higher than normal interest rate, but you're not going to go through all the brain damage of getting a loan, and therefore, I'm happy, you're happy, we all move on down the road, okay?
Wasn't that essentially what private equity people do?
To a certain extent, yeah.
Yeah, but.
And they tap out all their regular lenders.
Absolutely.
A lot of,
Jim?
Professor, a lot of developers like the Lenore Homes that offer their own financing for their new construction, when you put a client through one of their packages, sometimes the client will have horrible credit, especially if they're like in Port St. Lucie or Palm Bay. They will get that person that property and finance, and when you look at everything, the house was sold like really high. Like the pricing of the house was sold really high compared to what's sold outside the neighborhood.
Yep. That's exactly what we're talking about here. Yep.
So you mentioned having bad credit, you could essentially use also the interest loan only, right?
Yep. Absolutely. You could use an interest-only loan, and that basically would help qualify the person that much more so because of the lower payment, but yet they're probably going to default, or they're never
It's
going
going
to.
to be still your property too.
Right.
Do we cover hard money loans in this class?
We can later on.
Okay.
Okay. Any other general questions? Okay. We've got some extra time. Does everybody have their laptop with them here? Okay. And those of you at home, I'm assuming you've got a laptop, so you're obviously looking at something. So let us, and this is the first time I have attempted to do this with Zoom, so we shall see whether or not.
Is this Excel you're going to?
We're going to try to go to Excel. And if this fails, if this fails miserably, then we will try something else. And okay, let's see if it pulls up. Okay, is Excel pulling up on your screens? I mean, on what I'm showing you anyway?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, I'm going to blow it up a little bit so we get some decent size on the fonts. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to start out some of the different things that we've been learning during the calculator, that sort of thing. We're just going to build a basic mortgage model from scratch, and we'll kind of begin to add some different bells and whistles to it over time. But we're going to start with the basics, okay? So you can, if you want to try to, if you don't want to follow along, that's fine. If you want to follow along, that's fine. This is up to you. This is not a quiz, by the way. Okay, so you can relax on that part. This is, just for fun. Or not for fun, but basically so you can kind of begin to see how some of the stuff fits together. Okay. So I'm just going to start with the basics. Loan amount, loan term in years, interest rate, and let's just say loan payment. Okay, so let's just start here with $100,000 loan. Loan term in years is going to be 30 years. Interest rate, I'm going to put in at 10%. And then we're going to solve for payments. Okay, so this is the first actual calculation or computation in Excel. We're going to use the payment formula. And so here we start out with the first variable that we've got to include, much like on your calculator, in terms of you've got to put in the variables. The rate, which is the first one. Now, in this case, we're going to take that rate, we're going to divide it by 12 because of monthly compounding. All right. Then, number of periods, we're going to go up to the cell C4 for the number of years. We're going to multiply that by 12, since it's obviously 12 periods per year, annual or monthly compounding. And then the last one is the loan amount or the present value. And then we don't have to do the future value or the type. So we're just going to start with that. Okay, so we end up, there it is. $877.57 is our payment amount. Now, if we want to kind of, begin to, clean things up a little bit. We'll make that like a dollar amount. Want to make this maybe an interest rate. And, okay, so we'll start with that. Okay, was everybody able to do that pretty quickly?
No.
Can you go back to the formula?
Yeah.
The only formula is just the payment, okay?
Professor, this is what we learn in the financial modeling class next semester, right? The next 8 weeks.
You will learn some of that, yeah.
So C5 is the 10% divided by the 12,
Yes.
so, okay. Interest divided by 12.
See, in Excel it's a little bit different than it is on the calculator, because in Excel, you've got to tell it, okay, we've got 12 payments per year. This is your way of telling Excel there's 12 payments per year. And adjusting the interest rate and adjusting the term.
Times 12, yeah, okay. And then C4 is term, okay.
Okay, now, so what you're going to do is come down here, maybe let's go down to, I don't know, line 10, just to kind of give us a little bit of space. And here, we're going to put in the period. This is going to be like month 1, 2, 3, that sort of thing. And then here, we're going to put beginning balance. Here, we're going to put payment amount. Here, we're going to put interest paid. And ending balance. Okay, so this is no different than what we, did by hand, obviously a couple of weeks ago. Just going to kind of center it, clean it up a little bit. Right.
Is this the F minus equals B minus C, or B minus C?
Basically, yes. Okay, so here we'll start with period number 1, and then our beginning balance, we're just going to pull from above, which would be the original loan amount, C3. Okay, and then the initial payment is just going to be pulling down from above as well. Oops. Okay, so those are just basically cell referencing the cells above. All right, now for the interest, okay, in Excel, there's several different ways to do this, but I like to have people do it sort of by hand on this, because it makes it, I think, a little bit easier to understand. So if you remember, the interest paid is going to be your beginning balance of the 100,000 times, in this case, your interest rate divided by 12. Boom. Okay? And then the principal repaid, we can do this a couple different ways. One, since that's a negative number, add it to the other, or we could take and make the 877.57 a positive number. Then it would make more sense to do basically that minus the interest paid.
Right.
Once again, I know this is new. This is all what we did by hand, okay? So you're just simply subtracting out the interest from the payment amount to get the principal, and then the ending balance, if you remember, is simply taking the beginning balance minus the principal repaid, okay? Then we come down to period number 2, and the beginning balance for period number 2 is the ending balance for period 1.
No, it wasn't me.
Okay. All right. Our payment is going to stay constant. All right. Now, our interest, we should be able to also just
Copy that.
copy it down.
Formula, right?
Copy the formula. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do it that way. But so we should be able to say, dang it, why is my thing acting weird?
Control C.
Okay, done there. All right.
Yeah.
So basically, if you highlight those, we'll drag those down one. Let's control this. This is not working well. Ugh. Okay. We're going to go back. We've got to edit. And in this case, it is going to be C6, B13. C5. Okay, I'm going to explain what I'm doing here just in a second. Okay, so one of the things that, if you're not familiar with Excel, or you are, there's a difference between what are called static cell references and dynamic cell references. Static cell references are ones where you want to keep the reference constant. You want to keep it fixed. You don't want it to move, okay, in terms of what it's looking back at to capture. A dynamic cell reference is one that you want it to change as basically other variables change, okay? You'll see what I mean here in this sort of cell. All right, so for example, if you simply try to copy down what is in cell D12, which is B12 times C5 divided by 12, what you've got is B12 is a dynamic cell reference that you want to change as it goes down the spreadsheet. But the C5, you don't want that changing. You want it fixed. And so one way to fix it in Excel is you put these little dollar signs in front of basically the row and the column. Okay, so you make it $C, $5. All right, and so what that does is as you then would copy it down the page, whoops, as you would copy it down the page, it's not going to change. All right, and so you just look at this one right below it, okay? It's not changing. Now, what should be the case, based upon what we've done here, is once we've got this sort of second row populated, by making that change, we should be able to copy down and keep copying down all the way to basically the end. All right, now then let's go up. So what we should see is at month, well, what will be ultimately month 360. Okay,
What
stop it
happened
right
there?
here.
No.
Get rid of all this. Okay, so this is going to be, basically this is month 360, what's happening there. So we should be able to copy down, let's just copy down from the top here. Okay. So there's several ways to sort of accomplish what I'm doing here in terms of changing the cells from one to the next. One little trick that you can do is do equal 1 plus the cell above it, and then copy down. There's a reason why we sort of want to do that, just from the standpoint of how we're going to deal with some of these numbers later. Okay. Okay, so in a matter of a couple of minutes, we've got now a fully functioning sort of basic amortization schedule. So assuming we did everything correct, we should be able to go up here, change the loan amount to, let's say, 200,000. Yep. Looks like, well, make a column wider. Okay, change the term to 15. Change the interest rate, 1%. Okay, so you should be able to change any of the variables, and everything should change below. Okay, so once again, let's say that we've got a loan for $500,000. We've got a 10-year loan at 5%. Okay, there's your monthly payment and your full amortization schedule below.
Oh, I love that.
So now you can see this takes virtually no time at all compared to obviously what you're going to do with the calculator. And as I said, the reason I show you this now as opposed to showing you at the beginning, you would rely on this and you're not really understanding what's going on if you hadn't seen what we did with the calculator, okay, to get to these numbers. Okay, all this is doing is just simply doing the calculations for each and every, month throughout basically the loan. Now what we can begin to do is obviously complicate this model. We can start adding in loan origination fees. We can start adding in prepayment penalties. We can start adding in administrative fees. We can start adding in adjustable rate mortgage features. All of that can be basically added to this model, continually manipulating it until we get a model that basically does everything that we've done up to this point. Does that make sense? Okay? Is everybody with me?
Yep.
I love this.
Okay? Now, at this point, we'll, excuse me, we will, let's see, what can I do? Just a simple one. Yeah, well, okay, I think we're going to wait and do that next week. I'm just thinking about this because I think that at this point, it's probably going to be better that we sort of pick this up from scratch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to email this to you, okay? So you'll have it. You can start playing around with it, but we're going to start adding some things to it next week, okay? So at this point, it's 10:55. Any other questions? Otherwise, we'll be done, and you can obviously start the quiz at 11:15 if you choose to do so.
Yeah, the row 2, do you have to do the calculation row 2 and row 1 and then copy down all the way to 60?
I find it that it's easier because here's the thing. The calculation for the row 2, the only difference that makes it easier to cut down is that you're stealing the beginning balance from the ending balance of the previous period, and you don't have that for period 1 because you're stealing it from above.
Okay.
And so you see the cell reference here
I don't know why it's not.
is C3.
I want Excel to recognize that.
Yeah, and then
you have to put it in the
but for this, the cell reference is obviously the ending balance.
Right.
Okay? So that's why I always just go through, put everything in for the first 2 months, and then you can just copy everything from 2 months
You see the formula
forward.
up here?
Put that in your cell.
Okay?
So on mine, C6 is the
All right.
interest rate.
Let's see.
When you say they're
So,
sending it to
no,
us, you're just
first you
sending,
wanna
it will have
do
the
a
formulas
parentheses.
in
I'm
it?
just going to send it just as it is.
And then if you
Okay.
want to use, capital.
Matter of fact, I'm going to save it right now.
And then you're dividing it by 12. Then you have a comma. And then you want to do the loan term.
Really?
So C4.
Oh,
And you're multiplying that one
that's where's this one?
by 12. Because it's 30 years and you want to
Yes,
make
I
sure
know.
it's
Where is the
360.
physical
I don't
part?
know.
Oh,
Tell
for
by
multiplying
the
is
same
this.
reason. Thank you for the
Yeah, sorry.
No, it's me that's negative, I'm sorry.
And then comma. And then you have your loan amount,
Yeah.
C3. Close
So if the rest of you that are out there in Zoom land, if you want to hang on, you can, but all I'm going to do is just send this to you via email. So, unless you have questions about something.
We didn't multiply by 12 after the C4. So you have the C4 multiply, and then put 12, and now you can hit enter and check it.
Dr. Forty,
Yeah?
I was just wondering if I can get the answers I got wrong on there, on the midterm.
baffled on why. I thought I did really well yesterday.
It's right up here.
Well, I will take care of that later this weekend.
All right, thank you.
Have a good weekend, Dr. Forty.
Absolutely. Good.
Oh, I'll send you an email about the
And then
quiz.
the loan amount.
5, you opened it up last night?
Close parentheses.
Yeah, well, no, it's open today at 11:15.
And then
Yeah, you posted it last
That's
night.
where I got
I'll
lost.
send you quick.
No, but it doesn't open until today.
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
And, or study the sheet that he sends us, you know?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So could we make an Excel template for each concept problem and then essentially plug in different numbers?
Yes. Yes, you can.
That's kind of neat.
Yep.
Have a good one. And maybe with the 2 phones.
Yeah, no, I have one for work, and then my personal one is like the most broken phone ever. I can deduct it, you know, the phone payment.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Yeah, no, I do. I do.
Are we the only ones left?
I don't know.
Here, I just sent you. And then, so it's usually better for a tax credit versus a tax reduction as in opportunity zones?
Just in general, yes.
Okay. Oh yeah, that's my question. Is there a way to download the Zoom recording to your computer from Canvas?
I do not know.
I could not figure it out, but I know if the person records the Zoom themselves, they're able to do that.
Okay. I do not know.
Okay. That might be helpful, months or years later, versus the YouTube, I think, because you can see the work worked out.
Yep.
Just a thought.
Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.